In 2003, a programmer named Terry Davis claimed God spoke to him through his computer screen. What followed was one of the most bizarre and brilliant solo software projects in history. An entire operating system built from scratch with divine instructions. He created TempleOS with self-imposed limits, 16 colors, 640 by 480 resolution, no internet. Why turn down modern tech for constraints most of us would see as crippling? He said God told him to. It worked, and it tragically destroyed him. Terry Andrew Davis was born on December 15, 1969, in West Allis, Wisconsin. From an early age, computers weren't just toys for him, they were puzzles asking to be solved. While other kids soaked up games on floppy disks, Terry was already asking what made the pixels move, what instructed the machine to behave the way it did, and how those invisible commands could be rewritten. That spark set the tone for a lifelong obsession. At home, two machines in particular grabbed his focus: the Apple II and the Commodore 64. For many children, these were entertainment centers. Load up a simple game, mash keys, and sink into the pixels. For Terry, they became playgrounds with hidden tools, rich fields of possibility that only opened up if you knew how to speak their secret language. He'd copy bits of code from books and magazines, tinker with them, break them, and try again. What others saw as a finished product, a game or a program, he saw as a starting point to pry beneath the surface. That ability to turn play into structured exploration was one of his earliest patterns. It wasn't long before teachers noticed that he stood out. Terry was placed in gifted classes at school, where he could spend time exploring questions far more complex than the usual curriculum. That label unlocked advanced resources, but it also had a side effect. The deeper into computing he moved, the less overlap he had with the interests of his peers. While classmates talked about TV shows or traded floppy disks of arcade clones, he was more interested in assembly listings. Opportunities gave him freedom, but they also left him further apart socially, an early glimpse of how capability and isolation would run side by side in his life. One of his biggest breakthroughs came when he taught himself to program an assembly language on a Commodore 64. Assembly is not a forgiving introduction. It forces you to work almost one-on-one with the processor, breaking every action into a set of raw instructions. For a teenager, most would stick with easier, higher-level languages. Terry went straight into the hardest option. By learning in that stripped-down way, he trained himself to think in the smallest steps the computer could understand. That early skill, knowing the machine almost at the instruction level, is the very same instinct that makes building an operating system later in life seem possible, when to most people it would feel impossible. His learning style reinforced this. He would try, break, and rebuild, often in quick cycles. Nothing about it was linear or guided, and he rarely relied on instructions beyond a rough code snippet. That brute force trial and error method was exhausting at times, but it developed a mindset tuned for deep technical puzzles. It matches the pattern we see with his later TempleOS project. Independent, self-taught, and prepared to reinvent a solution if none seemed to exist. The independence that came from this self-training shaped more than his skills. It shaped his mindset. If a computer couldn't meet his needs, he assumed the answer was to change the computer itself. If no clear path was provided, one had to be carved by hand. That approach gave him unusual confidence in tackling big goals, but it also meant he had far less practice with collaboration. Research points out that children who spend formative time working alone on technical projects often get less experience in group problem-solving. In Terry's case, this meant he could solve extraordinarily difficult technical problems alone. But teamwork didn't come as naturally. That gap, small in childhood, would grow larger as he moved forward into adult life. Still, looking back, the signs are crystal clear. At an age when computers were primarily designed as small entertainment boxes, Terry was already moving beyond play and into raw engineering. The combination of curiosity, discipline, and isolation created a foundation that no one else around him quite matched. He wasn't simply a child tinkering for fun. He was sharpening tools that could, decades later, be aimed at one of the most ambitious personal computing projects ever attempted. These early choices gave him direction, but also set him apart. And that duality, unusual brilliance tied to quiet separation, was becoming part of his story. He had the skill. He had the drive. What lay ahead was the chance to test those in larger, more formal environments, where computers weren't just hobby machines, but engines of real-world innovation. That step from independent experimenting to professional engineering would soon define his next chapter. By 1994, Terry had earned a master's degree in electrical engineering from Arizona State University, formalizing years of self-directed exploration with hard academic grounding. His studies included circuits, logic design, system integration, mathematics, and advanced programming. It was a demanding program, but in many ways it channeled exactly the persistence that had defined his earlier years. He didn't abandon his habit of experimental tinkering. Instead, he folded it into the structure of graduate-level expectations. Nights often stretched long as he ran calculations or worked through code, sharpening both his theoretical knowledge and his ability to implement it in working systems. The degree anchored his credibility in the technical world, proving he could bridge independent learning and structured research. Following graduation, Terry entered the professional world. He worked at Ticketmaster, where his quick, compact, and reliable code gained notice. The company depended on software efficiency to handle large bursts of ticket sales without failure, and Terry proved capable of building automation and support systems that met those demands. For his peers, it was clear he had the rare ability to take on complex technical problems and return usable solutions quickly. In a setting where delays meant direct business losses, that talent mattered. These years provided him with real-world impact, showing how his technical precision could keep critical infrastructure running smoothly. At the same time, life outside that work was beginning to reveal a much more complicated story. By 1996, Terry experienced disturbances that led to his first psychiatric hospitalization. What initially presented as paranoia suspicions about co-workers, feelings of being monitored too closely moved well beyond ordinary workplace stress. Doctors diagnosed him with bipolar disorder, though the diagnosis later evolved toward schizophrenia. Looking back, this period represents the first significant collision between Terry's extraordinary abilities and the effects of a severe mental illness emerging in his 20s, which is often when symptoms appear. Though he could still deliver strong code, his conversations sometimes spiraled into ideas that confused colleagues. At one point, he might present a clear, elegant programming solution, and a day later he might express fears of hidden surveillance. For those around him, it was a disorienting contrast. The same mind capable of technical brilliance was also beginning to warp how he interpreted social and professional interactions. Productivity didn't vanish, but it shifted. Increasingly, elements of metaphysics and religion appeared in how he described his work. Terry began speaking of programming in spiritual terms. To him, code wasn't only a list of instructions for processors. It was a language capable of carrying divine meaning. He started to believe that God had assigned him tasks far beyond Ticketmaster's deadlines. Instead of viewing completed projects only as company contributions, Terry cast them in the light of larger missions, as if each function or system represented a step toward fulfilling responsibilities entrusted to him from above. This shift marked the beginning of his growing separation from conventional career paths. Over time, the spiritual framing overtook his perspective on professional advancement. While peers pursued promotions or built resumes for steady career growth, Terry increasingly described his real purpose as something different altogether. He believed his abilities weren't meant to propel him through corporate hierarchies, but to serve in building a system with sacred importance. Conversations about milestones or future plans gave way to reflections on divine instructions. To outside observers, it looked as though he was moving away from professional opportunities, just as his career was gaining traction. But from his vantage point, he was aligning more closely with a mission that couldn't be measured by salary or titles. This redirection wasn't simply resignation or decline in competence. He maintained his skills and the drive to create. He simply earmarked them for a different outcome. His focus narrowed until the energy he once poured into industry work instead flowed toward visions he framed as divinely mandated. The academic achievement of 1994 and the industry productivity of the mid-1990s were not forgotten or abandoned. They became resources he believed he was obligated to repurpose. Every lesson in circuits, every optimized function, every tested routine could now be drawn into a larger vision. By stepping away from conventional career tracks, Terry made a choice few engineers could imagine, taking strong industry potential and rerouting it towards something that no employer could have requested. To him, technical mastery wasn't meant to enrich companies or shareholders. It was meant to serve a higher order, That belief gradually reshaped his daily life, narrowing his focus away from team projects and business goals, and toward a vision he insisted he had been given directly. This conviction took hold so firmly that he no longer talked about his future as an engineer at all. Instead, he spoke about assignments from God. What others viewed as the end of a regular industry career, he understood as the true beginning of something different. His purpose was shifting, and the language he used made the direction clear. The work ahead was not commercial, it was sacred. It was at this moment that Terry's identity as a skilled programmer and his experiences with mental illness intertwined into a single path. Those who knew him saw someone turning away from stable income and predictable roles. But Terry saw only forward momentum into the work he claimed had been appointed to him. With the degree, the professional record, and the conviction that he now had instructions from God, his life was steering toward a project of unusual scope, one that would attempt to merge the world of code with the world of faith. That project would come to define him, beginning with a simple and startling claim. He believed God had told him to build an operating system. Terry described a revelation in which he believed God told him to construct a third temple, not from materials but as an operating system. He called it TempleOS. In his view, Scripture had once directed ancient builders to raise physical spaces of worship, and now his role was to do the same through code. For Terry, this was not metaphor. He treated every technical choice as part of a covenant, convinced that his work was a command rather than a personal hobby. Understanding the weight of that claim requires seeing what he took on. Building an operating system is one of the hardest tasks in computing. Teams with dozens of programmers can spend years on the core kernel, drivers, and interfaces. An OS is not just another program, it commands how all other programs interact with hardware, controls memory management, processor communication, graphics, sound, and device drivers. Terry set out to do all of this alone, and he saw the sheer scope not as a reason to stop, but as proof that the assignment must have come from God. In his mind, no ordinary developer would take something so impossible unless it was divinely required. At first, he referred to the project as J Operating System, but the name TempleOS captured his conviction more directly. He really meant temple. In his words, God would reside within this new digital environment, and the system itself would be holy ground set apart by design. What makes that even more striking is that Terry insisted the system's specifications had been handed down through revelation. He spelled them out and treated them as non-negotiable. 640 by 480 resolution, a 16-color palette, single audio voice through PC speaker-style output, no networking, 64-bit design, single address space with no paging, and no encryption or passwords. To outside developers, these looked like arbitrary limitations, but for Terry, they were given commandments he had to follow. Why those specs? On one level, they echoed the technology of the late 1980s, simple VGA graphics, direct CPU access, no network stack, minimal sound hardware. By the 2000s, when Terry was actively coding TempleOS, mainstream systems supported millions of colors, rich sound libraries, online access, and deeply layered protections. Terry deliberately turned his back on all of that. He said the rules preserved transparency, kept the system close to the metal, and stripped away complexity. To him, layers of abstraction muddied divine purity. The restrictions were not mistakes or oversights. They were, in his words, holy precision. Most programmers would bristle at such decisions. Why tie yourself to the equivalent of an old VGA machine? Why cut yourself off from the internet? Why eliminate security entirely? For Terry, the answer was constant. Those options were outside the rules, and breaking them would mean breaking obedience. He cast the coding process itself as worship, where following design orders mattered as much as output. He didn't present these as preferences or throwback nostalgia. He spoke about them as requirements dictated by God through revelation. As a result, the project's power came from narrow focus. TempleOS lacked features that developers in the 2000s would consider basic networking, multi-tier protections, high-end graphics drivers. But what remained was lean, coherent, and immediate. Booting TempleOS dropped you straight into its command environment with full access to the internals. There was no wall between the user and the machine. Commands ran at top level, graphics drew directly to the screen, and sound played in its simplest form. This stripped-down design caught the attention of other programmers, because in place of modern OS opacity, TempleOS showed its mechanics openly. Its simplicity created exactness. Everything was visible. Nothing was hidden behind deep APIs. And the name itself mattered. By calling the system TempleOS, Terry declared that programming it was not neutral work. He described his hours coding as acts of worship. Every line edited in the compiler, every adjustment to the kernel, was offered as obedience. He viewed the system as sacred space carved in digital form. That conviction gave the OS an unusual intensity. It wasn't branding, and it wasn't irony. He genuinely understood the system as a temple, carried forward each day through typing and testing. From the outside, this mixture of theology and engineering looked odd, even eccentric. But some developers recognized the blunt clarity beneath it. Here was one person linking religious devotion and deep system design in a single project. The rules that seemed outdated actually explained everything about the system's character. TempleOS had no filler features, no compromises for market appeal. It was Terry's conviction manifested in code. So when you put these elements together, TempleOS was not simply an experiment in minimalist computing. It was a technical environment bound tightly to a personal theology. That made it both fascinating and difficult to categorize. For many, the idea of following divine rules into such outdated technical limitations was hard to accept. For Terry, those very limits proved the system's sanctity. The question then becomes, with all these strict constraints in place, what did the system actually look like when you opened it up? How did those commandments shape the code and tools he built? Could one person actually sit down and build an entire operating system from scratch? For Terry Davis, the answer was yes. TempleOS wasn't pieced together from borrowed libraries or lifted frameworks. Every line came from him, about 119,667 lines of code in total, including comments, which observers often rounded to roughly 120,000. To some, that scale felt like watching one person construct a skyscraper by hand, and the thing actually worked. It booted quickly, ran programs, and contained tools and features far beyond what most expected from a single developer sitting alone. At the core of TempleOS was HolyC, Terry's own twist on the C language. It wasn't just a syntax variation. He made HolyC both the operating system's primary language and its interactive shell. Unlike most environments, where you write code, compile it, then test, HolyC let you type directly into the TempleOS editor and run code immediately. There was no long compile test loop. You could write a line, press enter, and watch it execute at the top level of the OS. For programmers used to waiting through build cycles, that speed felt alien and exciting, like working with a live wire. That immediacy was possible because TempleOS came with a built-in compiler and just-in-time execution across the system. If you wrote a function in HolyC, it wasn't just running in a sandbox or user space. It was live, with access to the whole system. That meant curiosity rewarded itself instantly. If you wanted to test how an internal call worked, change graphics behaviors, or redefine parts of the kernel, you could do it right there, in real time, with no artificial barriers. For developers who like to tinker, the experience was deeply unusual. The operating system also included ambitious multimedia tools. There was an integrated graphics pipeline with both 2D and 3D capabilities, complete with a sprite editor you could use to design characters or game objects on the fly. He even built a simple flight simulator, a striking example of what his graphics engine could do despite its 16-color palette. Alongside that sat a homemade file system that handled storage and retrieval with surprising reliability, an editor fully native to the OS, and a set of programs Terry called games. Many of them featured biblical references or random oracles pulled from text, reflecting that fusion of faith and programming that marked almost everything he built. TempleOS wasn't simply technical infrastructure, it doubled as a personal canvas, full of his own themes and touch. One detail that often startled developers was how accessible the system internals were. There was no protective wall between you and the core. Everything in TempleOS ran in Ring 0, the processor's most privileged mode. That meant you could inspect memory, redefine functions, or even overwrite critical parts of the kernel in a moment. Today's operating systems rely on abstractions and layered permissions to keep users safe. TempleOS replaced that shield with raw visibility and control. Terry saw that as a virtue. To him, those layers separated people from the truth of their machines. By stripping them away, he said he preserved purity. This philosophy made TempleOS feel both liberating and dangerous. On one hand, developers could explore nearly every corner of the system with complete freedom, learning how its parts tied together. On the other, it lacked the safety nets most people now take for granted: no protected memory, no user permissions, no security separation. If you broke something, the system crashed. If you wanted to dig deep, you could. That uncompromising transparency gave TempleOS its personality. It was a technical playground, not a practical workstation. For the programming community, those design choices forced a kind of double take. On the surface, TempleOS looked like a retro aesthetic trip, locked to a resolution and color depth from the 1980s. But under the hood, people found carefully engineered subsystems, a consistent single-address space, smooth graphics primitives, responsive audio, and a set of development tools that worked together seamlessly. Few who studied the code denied that it was real, functional, and in many ways elegantly crafted. Even with its constrained palette and absence of networking, the system often impressed those who gave it a closer look. And yet, admiration came with hesitation. TempleOS was inseparable from Terry himself, and by the time it gained attention online, his illness was public. On forums and live streams, his behavior veered from insightful to erratic. That reputation often bled into how others viewed the operating system. To some, it felt less like a tool and more like the artifact of one troubled man's struggles. Others insisted the technical merit should stand alone, pointing to TempleOS as an object lesson in what individual programmers could still accomplish if they dedicated themselves completely. Adoption was never Terry's goal. He didn't frame TempleOS as a competitor to Windows or Linux. He saw its very existence as the point. From that angle, its impracticalities: no internet, no security, limited graphics, were irrelevant. The accomplishment was in having built the environment at all, refining it until it was consistent, usable, and alive with his personal vision. When other developers tested it, many admitted it sparked creative ideas for how to simplify or rethink designs in their own worlds, even if they would never use TempleOS directly. Viewed up close, TempleOS stood as a challenge to assumptions. One person, working steadily over years, had proven that a full operating system with custom language, compiler, graphics pipeline, and file system could exist outside of corporate labs or collaborative open-source teams. While most programmers will never attempt such a feat, seeing that one individual did it stretched the imagination of what might be possible. It was less about replacing daily desktop environments than about showing that ambition, persistence, and clarity of focus still mattered in computing. And yet, the software was only half the story. To many who encountered TempleOS for the first time, what they noticed even more than the code was the man behind it, streaming his life, weaving theology into computing, and exposing his unstable mind to thousands in real time. That human presence became impossible to separate from the technical achievement. He streamed long coding sessions where he'd switch from explaining memory addressing to ranting about being spied on live, unedited. This was the side of Terry Davis that brought both attention and uncertainty. No other programmer at the time was broadcasting hours of kernel tweaking and compiler design mixed with spiritual monologues and conspiracy talk. For some, it was a front-row seat to technical mastery. For others, it became something closer to watching instability unfold in real time. Terry often treated the camera like a student in his classroom. While typing commands line by line, he would pause to give highly detailed explanations of how functions executed or how hardware registers responded. These weren't simplified lectures. He broke down concepts like stack frames or how his compiler handled type checking with the kind of clarity that textbooks often obscure. Then, in a matter of minutes, that focus could shift. He might interrupt his own explanation mid-sentence, yell about government surveillance, or veer into angry rants that sounded disconnected from the programming at hand. Those sudden swings gave his streams a rhythm that was both educational and chaotic. Because the sessions went out live, there was no edit, no chance to cut the material into a polished presentation. Viewers got everything: the brilliance, the breakthroughs, and the breakdowns. Many tuned in initially to see how he built TempleOS, but they quickly realized they were also watching late-night tirades, paranoid bursts, or arguments with imagined enemies. That exposure made his presence captivating to some, uncomfortable to others, and confusing to many who weren't sure what they had stumbled across. The reactions online split sharply. Some people tuned in to laugh at his behavior, clipping the most volatile outbursts and repackaging them into memes. These clips spread on forums and image boards, where they often played up his most extreme language. Others, though, insisted that he was a misunderstood genius and saw the ridicule as unfair, arguing that his creation should stand apart from his illness. As a result, every time he streamed, two audiences overlapped, one hoping to learn from his insights, and one waiting to capture his eruption into viral content. The conflicting tone of his sessions created infamous examples. Viewers could watch him quietly refine graphical routines, adjusting pixel colors, improving 3D rotations, testing rendering pipelines, and then, without warning, hear him accuse the CIA of intercepting his communications. Within the same hour, he could angrily pace in front of the screen, using racist or homophobic slurs, before calmly returning to point out why a pointer needed to be dereferenced. For newcomers, the shift felt almost impossible to process. For longtime watchers, it became strangely predictable. Cycles of ingenious teaching spiraling into paranoia, then snapping back to methodical detail. What stood out most to observers was how his schizophrenia unfolded on camera. Instead of being managed privately, his symptoms went public and unfiltered. The live stream format amplified everything. Moments of paranoia were no longer short-lived. They were replayed, reshared, and spread as entertainment. Forums built threads dedicated to cataloging his rants. Clips that highlighted his use of slurs or conspiracy talk became especially viral. This exposure meant that his most harmful language, racist and offensive remarks recorded during delusional episodes shaped how many people perceived him. It's important to put that into context. Numerous commentators pointed out that his words reflected symptoms of his mental illness more than reasoned positions. Some communities defended him on those grounds, arguing that mocking a schizophrenic man for his outbursts was an act of cruelty. Articles like God's Lonely Programmer tried to unpack the tragedy of someone so gifted being remembered mainly for his breakdowns. But whether they viewed his words as illness-driven or not, a large portion of the tech world kept its distance, unwilling to associate with him beyond a passing curiosity. Among those who stayed, the streams took on another dimension. Some followers viewed them as a kind of ongoing performance, as if Terry was unintentionally creating a new form of raw digital diary. They weren't watching solely for programming tips anymore. They were witnessing, day after day, how a man balanced or failed to balance unmatched technical focus with a consuming mental disorder. TempleOS itself was often discussed as much for the circumstances of its creation as for its features. The act of watching became a way of seeing both operating system development and human deterioration at once. Attention didn't provide relief. Unlike the recognition that helps most developers connect with peers, the spotlight Terry received mostly reinforced his isolation. The further clips traveled, the more they defined him as a character rather than a colleague. Online viewers laughed, made parodies, even idolized fragments of his rants, but very few stepped forward to help him in meaningful ways. The very infrastructure of streaming created a trap. He couldn't easily step away, yet he couldn't control what parts of himself the internet amplified. Over time, this cycle left him with a small but loyal following and a much larger audience treating him as spectacle. His genius was visible, but so were his most vulnerable moments, broadcast continuously. For many, that collision expert coding live on stream dissolving into delusional commentary became what defined Terry's online presence. All of this leaves us with a question worth asking. How did the community react in the long run? Did they actually help him, exploit him, or both? The next stage of his life would show how that attention, combined with his illness, brought him into a far harsher reality. By late December 2017, disagreements with his family reached a breaking point. His parents had insisted he stay on medication, but Terry believed those prescriptions dulled his thoughts and blocked what he saw as divine inspiration. Faced with an ultimatum, continue treatment or leave, he chose to walk away. From then on, he lived mostly out of a van, with no fixed home, no steady support, and little stability to fall back on. Life in the van shaped his final months. He often parked near libraries where he could access public computers, or at rest stops to find a safe place to sleep. Some days passed quietly while he adjusted or tested bits of TempleOS code. Other days unraveled into arguments with strangers, fueled by paranoia and mistrust. Without the grounding structure of a home or workplace, every part of his routine was fragile. He carried what he owned, moved often, and accepted discomfort as the price of refusing treatment. For him, independence was more important than a roof or regular meals. Online followers who respected his work tried to keep him afloat. People donated money, mailed food, or even offered him places to stay. A fan in Houston opened their home, and another in Atlanta tried to do the same. Terry sometimes took a meal or a small gift of cash, but most help was turned away. Pride kept him from relying on charity, and suspicion convinced him that offers might be traps. In his mind, help often looked like interference, and he interpreted even genuine kindness as suspect. Because of that, most efforts made only brief differences. His mistrust meant no safety net lasted long. The internet continued to follow him as if his decline were public property. His appearances on forums, videos, and streams were cataloged and repackaged, often ripped from their human context. To many online, he was a source of fascination or grim comedy. His instability was replayed as viral content, overshadowing the fact that he was a man living without shelter while managing schizophrenia alone. Some users sympathized, but even sympathetic voices admitted they had little means to make any real change. The blurry line between observation and mockery left Terry exposed, his struggles documented but rarely met with practical support. Through all of it, he still treated TempleOS as an active mission. In moments when he found access to a machine or his own hardware, he returned to the code. Small tweaks, adjustments. To his compiler, experiments with graphics, these remained part of his routine, even when food and rest were uncertain. His attachment was absolute. TempleOS wasn't past work to be remembered once it was ongoing service, the one constant he could control. To him, continuing to build was the act that kept purpose alive against all else. On August 11, 2018, near the Dalles, Oregon, Terry Davis was struck and killed by a Union Pacific train. Authorities could not determine whether it was intentional or accidental. He was 48 years old. In delivery, these words deserve a quieter pause, a slower cadence both to give respect to the ending of his life and to allow the weight of it to land fully with the listener. The news traveled immediately across the same networks that had followed him for years. Many programmers shared tributes, walking through TempleOS to highlight the technical accomplishment of one man building an OS alone. Others reminded people of the harm in his recorded words, unwilling to sidestep the slurs and erratic rants that had also defined his public image. Together, those reactions made clear that his legacy was not simple. A paradox of creative brilliance intertwined with personal struggle, reverence mixed with unease. Even after his death, that tension stayed unresolved. Some framed him as evidence of how society fails people with severe illness. Others saw him as a cautionary figure about the internet's appetite for spectacle, and many developers continued returning to TempleOS itself, studying the code as proof of what focused labor can construct in isolation. The OS and the man could not be separated, and both remained fixed in memory. His passing leaves questions as sharp as his achievements. The system he built remains, but so does the story of how isolation, illness, and a lack of support deepened his decline. For those who knew him only through streams or posts, the images may blur between awe, sadness, and discomfort. But the end of his life makes one truth hard to ignore: talent alone was not enough to save him. This loss points us back to the larger picture, where extraordinary ability collides with fragile circumstances. It challenges us to consider not only what Terry accomplished, but what his life tells us about the cost of creating, without care, connection, and community. If you'd like more stories and deep dives like this, remember to like and subscribe. Until next time.